So much is happening in our world today. Wars, wild weather, global corporations rivaling the power of democratic states, toxic nationalism. And we can't help but wonder, why? Where are we headed? Is there anything I can do? We felt much the same in September 1945, after 2 atomic bombs had forced Japan's surrender and put an end, we hoped, to a nightmare lasting 30 years. But when we surveyed the damage, only then did we realize how close we were to total annihilation. The effort to find people to blame turned out to be much harder than expected. While many gave in to hopelessness, a vital few began speaking of a new world based on a new understanding, progressive realism. It took issue with the common notions about humans that we are either good or evil, right or wrong, strong or weak, masters or slaves. The Nuremberg trials of defeated Nazi leaders may have seemed to promote this idea, when in fact what we witnessed at that trial was something new. Crimes against humanity, acts of destruction of unprecedented proportions, don't come down to a few men. The cause of this or that crime against humanity can be traced to any and all of us. What we saw during the trial of Göring, Rosenberg, Ribbentrop, and others was their boredom, bewilderment, their self-justification, their loyalty to some ideal, qualities we realize we all share. We too have the capacity to destroy and create, to hoard and give freely, to hate and love, to shun and embrace. After all, hadn't Hitler painted landscapes? Hadn't he wept at the opera? Wasn't it Hitler who was laughing when he said to the arch-hater Julius Streicher, "You anti-Semites take Jews too seriously"? If this was true, then these men with their death and prison sentences were mere proxies of the hidden dimensions of all humans. Sidelining them wasn't solving the problem of ourselves. If this happened once, it can happen again and again. An answer came 3 years later with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It said, "All humans have the inalienable right to dignity, without which there can be no freedom, justice, and peace." Given humanity's history of chucking up one human-caused disaster after another, causing untold millions of humans to suffer terribly and die needlessly, we were being introduced to the brand new business of not just making a list of freedoms and rights, but pronouncing it as being as fundamental to the human condition as birth and death. It is as disorienting to us at the time as the Wonderland Tea Party with the Mad Hatter and the March Hare must have been to Alice. Looking at it differently, what if in, say, 1905, the great powers of the day had declared the universality of humanness and the equality of rights of all people of every color, race, belief, and gender? But in 1948, the progressive realists knew that their work was not finished. They understood that well-intended words like inalienable rights and fairness and equality were not enough to prevent future wars or fill bellies. They pushed the discussion of rights into the realm of international law. In 1966, human rights treaties were signed that included the language of binding authority. To defy or ignore human rights came with real-world consequences. Having said that, today we still have millions of people with no rights. What would creators of the UDHR say about Gaza, Sudan, Ukraine, or the dire conditions of Afghan women, or the millions made homeless by war and human-caused climate disaster? We might frame it with ecological language. If part of the natural system is damaged, all of that system is at risk. To deprive tens of thousands of children in Gaza of their families and food, homes, and education is to diminish the value of all children, including the children of billionaires and white nationalists. Bigger wars and more ruthless dictatorships are not just likelier to happen, they are the next logical step. The thinking of the past hasn't gone away. It is there in Donald Trump's Make America Great Again. It is there in the old economic thinking made new again. These people tell us that there is no such thing as inalienable rights. They tell us that no one deserves anything just because they were born. Expecting a good shelter and clean water and a homeland is panhandling, is communistic. Share and share alike? That's how we all become poor. Tipping the scales to benefit the weaker side with racial quotas or public housing or progressive taxation is itself a crime. Wanting something, let alone needing something, requires that you fight for it. If any two people want the same plot of land or source of water, may the better man win. This zero-sum thinking was taken to its ultimate point by Vladimir Putin. A few days after Russia invaded Ukraine, when the West began imposing crippling sanctions, he ordered Russian nuclear arsenal on high alert, justifying a nuclear holocaust with the words, "Why do we need a world if Russia is not in it?" A hot topic these days is gender identity. 3 Canadian provinces recently passed legislation that requires children under 16 with doubts about their sexual identity to speak first with their parents. Identity, these governments declared, must fit with family values, a term as loaded as it is ambiguous. Many are concerned that the challenges imposed on this identity issue won't stop here, that this legislation is the beta version of broader human rights rollback legislation. How far would it go? Those who wish to resist this trend must begin by understanding their rights. What does the Universal Declaration of Human Rights say about gender identity rights? What are the stakes for LGBTQ+ communities around the world where these rights are denied? What is Amnesty International doing at home and abroad when governments fall short of their treaty obligations? Gender rights are implicit in the preamble of the UDHR. The inherent dignity and the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. A world in which human beings shall enjoy freedom of speech and belief and freedom from fear and want is the highest aspiration of the common people. There are several articles in the body of the UDHR that are explicit about gender identity. Article 2, for instance, declares that everyone is entitled to all the rights and freedoms set forth in this declaration without distinction of any kind, such as race, color, sex, language, religion, political or other opinion, national or social origin, property, birth, or other status. If there was a time that the term sex was ambiguous, it is now clarified by the UN in a 2018 update. Sexual orientation and gender expression form an integral part of an individual's identity the world over. And then Article 3 tells us that everyone has the right to life, liberty, and the security of person. The word life has often been taken to mean the right not to be executed. It means more than that. Having life is a priceless thing, and each of us must be free to live it with dignity, without physical harassment, without legal discriminations. While the revolutionary ideas of the UDHR had the power to prick the conscience, there was still no obligation to abide by it. Many continued business as usual. In the years since 1945, there were mass killings for ethnic, national, and ideological reasons in Eastern Europe. There was civil conflict in the Middle East around the creation of the State of Israel. The bloody civil war in China and its even bloodier revolution was one of a succession of wars of colonial independence. The Cold War brought both brutal suppression of human rights on both sides and the development of new nuclear ballistic technologies designed to kill entire cities from far greater distances. But we knew too much to lose faith. What was needed to make these rights stick, to see them enforced all as one, indivisible and interdependent? After years of negotiations, 2 international covenants, one on civil and political rights, one on social, economic, and cultural rights, were adopted by the UN General Assembly in 1966 and brought into force 10 years later. They are now ratified by 193 countries. Together, they were called the International Bill of Human Rights. Article 2.2 of the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights lays out the legal obligations of the signing parties to protect and to preserve basic human rights, including equality before the law, equal protection of the law, and freedom from discrimination on any grounds. Part 4 of the Covenant sets out the mandate of the Human Rights Committee. It is an elective group of 18 human rights experts given the task of monitoring the implementation of rights set out in the Covenant. It investigates complaints of violations of civil and political rights, and, where necessary, engages in formal discussions with the state in question to help it comply with its obligations to human rights. The International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights takes a different tack regarding compliance. Article 2 urges the state parties to achieve progressively the full realization of the UDHR. Beginning in the preamble, recognizing the inherent dignity and equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family, and the ideal of human beings to enjoy freedom from fear and want, with the proviso that as important as individual rights are, all of us have the duties to other individuals and to the community to which we belong. And proceeding with Article 12, it is with the right of everyone to the enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health. In Article 13, it says, education shall be directed to the full development of the human personality and the sense of its dignity, and shall strengthen the respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms, and enable all persons to participate effectively in a free society, promote understanding, tolerance, and friendship. This is a recent map. It indicates where gender identity rights are treated progressively by law and restricted and banned outright. There has been a rising antipathy to gender identity issues around the world. Even where the map is blue, as we have seen, there is a risk of some rights being rolled back to where they were decades ago. In more specific terms, the LGBTQ plus communities face varying degrees of criminalization in up to 70 countries. There are death sentences in Iran, Brunei, Saudi Arabia, Uganda, Mauritania, Nigeria, and Yemen. Up to 10 years in prison in Ghana and Egypt, 20 years in Uganda. Extrajudicial killings in Chechnya, Gaza, Iraq, Malaysia, South Africa, Kenya, Liberia, Ghana, Cameroon, Senegal, Honduras, and the criminalization of LGBTQ plus events in Burundi, Turkey, Mozambique, and Lebanon. In many areas, hate messaging is permitted or encouraged, creating risks to safety and well-being. In Russia and Hungary, there are bans on any public material seeming to popularize a non-binary lifestyle, as in its literature, school materials, and advertising. In Zambia, harassment through doxing, blackmail, and trolling. More barriers have been designed to block access to employment, housing, healthcare, privacy, and protection from physical attacks. Family values campaigns are in fact the face of a global anti-gender movement. Most legislation is overbroad and can be interpreted however state officials choose. Where the human rights of the LGBTQ are at risk, governments and populist sentiment can't act with impunity. It takes human rights groups like Amnesty International to bring abuses to light. As dismissive as governments appear to be, they have very thin skins. When pressure is applied in the ways Amnesty is famous for, changes happen. Sometimes quick change, sometimes it's evolutionary. By 1961, Peter Benenson was 40 years old. He was from a Jewish family. His father, an army colonel, died when Peter was 9. As a 16-year-old studying at Eton College, he demonstrated his social conscience by establishing a relief fund for children orphaned by the Spanish Civil War. He spent World War II at Bletchley Park as a cryptographer. After the war, he became a barrister and ran 4 times unsuccessfully as a Labour candidate. Then in 1957, he turned his attention towards 2 issues: reforming the UK justice system and lobbying on behalf of those fighting to free Cyprus from British rule. In the way of epiphanies, Benenson's was most mundane. It came one morning on his way to work while reading a newspaper. He explains it this way. It was on the 19th December, 1960, as I was reading in the tube, that I came on a short paragraph that related how 2 Portuguese students had been sentenced to terms of imprisonment for no other offense than having drunk a toast to liberty in a Lisbon restaurant. This news item produced a righteous indignation in me that transcended normal bounds. His response appeared in the Observer newspaper, May 28, 1961. "Open your newspaper any day of the week," he wrote, "and you will find a report from somewhere in the world of someone being imprisoned, tortured, or executed because his opinions or religion are unacceptable to his government. There are several million such people in prison, and their numbers are growing. The newspaper reader feels a sickening sense of impotence. Yet, if their feelings of disgust all over the world could be united into a common action, something effective could be done." What has that seed become? A global movement of over 10 million members in 170 countries. Its purpose, to fulfill the promise of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, acting to protect human rights wherever governments fail. There have been countless events since, involving people from every dimension of life, every party of the world, young and old, the oppressed and their allies.
In the first half of the 20th century, humanity faced
a world war,
followed by the Spanish flu pandemic,
followed by the worst global economic depression ever seen,
followed by another world war.
So in 1948, the nations of the world gathered to sign a landmark document enshrining fundamental human rights in hopes that it would help prevent more suffering.
It declared that human rights are universal.
Human
rights. Rights that provide dignity, mutual respect, and compassion regardless of race, sexuality, beliefs, or life choices.
Since then, many have fought hard to defend these rights.
But over 70 years later, we still have a lot of work to do.
At this very moment, our fundamental human rights are under threat around the globe.
Countless people are still fighting for justice, freedom, and equality.
That's where Amnesty International comes in. We believe that no matter how bad things get,
there is hope.
And change is possible.
Every day we work towards a world
where human rights are protected
and enjoyed by everyone.
Everywhere.
Activism works. See you on the streets.
We research human rights abuses. Our investigators and analysts are on the front lines,
documenting and shining a light on human rights abuses.
We expose the abusers and we expose the facts others try to suppress.
We lobby government and the powerful to make sure they keep their promises and respect international law.
We are completely independent and fearlessly report on human rights abuses without any ties to government or big business.
Through education and training, we help people claim their rights.
And we mobilise those with the greatest capacity to create change.
The people.
We are a growing movement of millions around the world, coming together to campaign for change.
We ask ourselves, what can we change about the world to ensure justice, freedom and equality for all?
We protest because we love ourselves and we love our people.
Indigenous justice.
It's refugee rights.
Gender equality.
LGBTQA+ rights.
Racial equality.
And climate justice.
Whether it's the rights of an individual, a community,
or all of us.
We stand up to any threat to freedom,
any threat to equality.
We challenge injustice.
Join us.
All people, regardless of their sexual orientation or gender identity, have the right to be equal under the law, to exercise their full range of human rights without exception. Amnesty is very active on the issue of gender identity rights. It works with local and national unions, women's groups, and a host of others in support of queer momentum. Doing so, governments are reminded of the UDHR, including its Article 2, all rights and freedoms without distinction of any kind, and its Article 3, the life, liberty, and the security of person. Amnesty is active in rallies in small communities and large around the world. Amnesty follows developing events. It issues detailed reports on abuses. This is done without regard of their political origin, left, right, socialist, conservative. Amnesty works through every medium: webinars, reading clubs, petitions, and online learning centers. Amnesty members appealed to governments with letters to key officials, meeting their MPs, sending petitions to Parliament, addressing concerns of the LGBTQ+ community, of rising incidences of hate, exclusion, and violence across Canada, and pushing for legislation that supports its health and well-being. Amnesty has people and material resources for every human rights issue, from organizing campaigns, building communities, helping student groups, public education, and activist training. When the Saskatchewan government amended the Education Act, UR Pride challenged its use of the Charter's notwithstanding clause to block future court challenges, and Amnesty International and 9 other groups were granted the right to intervene on behalf of UR Pride. Amnesty argues that while the notwithstanding clause may be used to override certain sections of the Charter, it cannot be used to override democratic rights. In the words of Amnesty's Secretary General, the notwithstanding clause is not a license to discriminate against children and youth and avoid the scrutiny of the courts. Ban Ki-moon was the UN Secretary General from 2007 to 2016. He was born in 1944 in a farming village in South Korea. In 2012, in an address to the Human Rights Council, he spoke of an upbringing in which issues like sexual orientation and gender identity were not discussed. Like many of my generation, I did not grow up talking about these issues, but I learned to speak out because lives are at stake, because it is our duty under the United Nations Charter and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights to protect the rights of everyone, everywhere. More profound even than this is his other message. If I can learn, become aware, support the rights of others, which in turn protects my own rights, anyone can.